I promise on everything in the world. She would never do that. That took all her guessing to say that.
Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. Sorry, is this too loud? Okay, all right. I have a loud voice, so I technically probably don't need this, but just so that we make sure everyone can hear us clearly, I'll use it as okay, and then we'll try to share. Hopefully, I probably won't be doing most of the talking, so I will pass this off. I could, and that would be scary, because I am a talker, but you didn't come to hear me talk tonight. I'm here to interrupt them and keep them on topic. That's my job. So I asked them to please forgive me in advance if I do interrupt them, but they promised me they would be very well behaved. So thank you for coming tonight. This is our library roundtable discussion. We wanted to have a panel of people who've been involved with the issue of the books that we've been trying to do something about at the library, and I had a lot of questions come in, so I appreciate people who are sending in questions. I will try to get to most of them. The earliest ones I was able to add in, and then we'll go from there and try to, and I think some came in later this afternoon. So I really appreciate those questions that you sent in. It will help us flesh out our discussion to the better benefit of everyone listening. Before we get started, I'd like to ask, this is Pastor Daniel Weyerbach. I should know your name way better than I just stumbled over it, because he is one of my pastors. So I'm going to ask him to open us in prayer, and then we'll continue the discussion here.
Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for an opportunity to gather around and just have a good, open, civil discussion about some tremendous topics that are near and dear to our heart, near and dear to the community, and we know near and dear to you. So Lord, we thank you for the freedom that we have here in this blessed country to go ahead and just openly discuss these things. Lord, I pray that the Spirit would just be used to encourage, to equip, to edify, maybe to challenge those that are listening to tonight's discussion. But in all things, we pray that you get the honor and the glory. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
My name is Sarah Sanchez. I live here in Prattville, and I am a former high school teacher. I taught government, social studies. I taught every prep in the social studies department because I was the newbie. And so anytime anyone went on maternity leave, they said, oh, you're doing this. Oh, and you're doing special ed, and you're doing business classes. So I kind of did everything, and then I left teaching to have a family, and I now homeschool my kids. And I got involved with Clean Up Prattville via a friend of mine referred me to Hannah. She said, I think you probably want to see what Hannah's doing. And we have a mutual friend. And so I grew up in public schools, went to a state college. My entire education was from a secular worldview, even though I am a Christian. And I've been a Christian since I was a child. So to say, I'm in a place now where this is not an issue that I probably would have taken on in terms of my conscience 20 years ago, necessarily, because I have been taught that my beliefs are supposed to stay out of the public sphere. That I'm supposed to be quiet, I'm supposed to let everybody else talk about their religion and talk about their values, but I am not supposed to do that. And most of my college classes, they would make jokes about Christians, make jokes about anyone who believes in creation, anyone who believes in the Bible, anyone who might be a Republican. So they were very tolerant. That was a long time ago. Anyway, I'm getting old now. But because I think we've moved on. I haven't heard the word tolerance in a while, but that was the word of the day. And I say that, and it's kind of funny to chuckle about it, but as I homeschool my kids, what I'm realizing is virtues are not the same as agendas. And the virtues that I'm teaching my kids at home, they're being taught through a biblical worldview, but those virtues apply to any situation. My children have learned to look at the world through a biblical worldview, but they would never view that as a license to be unkind to somebody and to be disrespectful to somebody, or to blindly take orders from, and they've also learned to not blindly take orders from people in authority, that people in authority can be wrong too. They're learning a set of principles. And I was taught if I challenged the wrong person that I wasn't being nice, or if I hurt somebody's feelings, I wasn't being nice. So it's a different, I'm getting a new education myself now, but when I heard about this issue, Hannah was reading excerpts of books at the city council. And so I immediately thought, I moved here from the DC area. I thought, I'm gonna go get to know this gal because first of all, she's fixing to get a major blowback from her culture. And we're on a downward slope. So these things, when you challenge them, it will blow back in your face and you will pay a price because the world slants the other way against the values that we're trying to uphold in our community and train our kids. So enough about me. That's just a little bit about my background, just so you understand who I am. I have up here to my left, I have Pastor Daniel Weierbach of Open Door Baptist. He's the associate pastor there. He has an apologetics ministry called C4C Apologetics, and lots of videos on YouTube. And he just seeks to engage in our culture with a biblical worldview, and from a logical standpoint, and because there's logic behind it, yeah. And then we have Brian Dawson over here, the president and CEO of 1819 Youth, and he engages in a lot of happenings across our state in terms of the political happenings and other happenings, but also the cultural state of Alabama. So he comes from that sort of expertise of monitoring the state of our, I almost said Commonwealth, this state. I used to live in a Commonwealth. They would be like, there's a Commonwealth. Okay. So thank you for being here. And then we have Hannah Reese. She is a homeschool mom and the director of Clean Up Alabama and Clean Up Prattville. And yeah, so we're happy to have her here as well. And she's going to be able to give a little update or background for those who are maybe newer to the conversation about how we have come to this point and what's been happening so far with our back and forth discussion and engagement with the city and the county and the library. So I'm going to hand this off to you for now. And I'm going to work through, if you can still hear me, I just have pages of questions. We're going to go through a section probably till about 40 minutes or so. Roughly, we'll see how this goes, okay? Because we didn't know how much time to allot for each thing depending on the discussion. And then we'll take a break, and then we'll finish out the rest of the discussion. So I'll try to hold us to our segment here, and then we'll also combine the questions in that were submitted. So I'm just going to ask the question, and then I'm going to kind of draw you guys in. If you, direct you if there's a certain question that you really feel strong you want to answer, you'll wrestle the microphone away from him, maybe. And, he's kind of like moving away there. But to start off with, I thought we should probably just talk about the basic idea of the purpose of the library. And the Alabama Public Library Service says that the purpose of Alabama libraries is the development of higher ideals of citizenship and the enlargement of opportunity for culture and recreation. So with that in mind, we're just going to ask the question tonight, how is our library accomplishing that, and how does that come into play with how they're managing the collections for the children's section to the teen section, and how are they choosing the materials there? So maybe Hannah, you could start off and just talk about the current situation in our library that you have found, and what you have found out about how things are selected, and how does it play into this development of higher ideals, citizenship, and et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's a great
Definition.
that is to promote the good of the community, the good of society, to foster literacy and education and these higher ideals of virtue and goodness, that we would live peaceably with one another, that we would strengthen one another as a community. And I would say what I love the library, and I've utilized the library for many years, and what I found in this past year, I was somewhat alarmed by. I was caught off guard that, those might have been my expectations for the library, but that wasn't the kind of materials that I was finding in the library. I was finding materials that were pushing a specific agenda on children that really wasn't a really space.
What agenda was that?
I would say that
Tell me
it
more about that.
I would say it would be geared towards this new wave of gender-affirming care, and some might call it LGBTQ, or some might deem it, people label it many different ways, but, I'm perfectly fine with that conversation in the realm of adults, but what was alarming that it was like a board book for a kid, and I was like, whoa, this is not really the conversation we're having with kids, is it the conversation we're having with kids? And so a group of moms got together and kind of realized the scope of the situation. And the scope was pretty alarming to us for a community like Prattville. We were like, surely something's not right. Like, surely this is a mistake or something. This isn't Chicago or New York City. This is Prattville, and the community I grew up in. And
So when you for people who are newer to your involvement here, when you brought it up, like what happened? Like, what was the response? Were the books requested? How are they selected? Like, how are they brought in?
yeah, that's a really good question. So I sat down immediately with the director, not the current director, but the previous one, and I was asking those same questions because I was definitely not going in with any kind of assumptions. Again, I kind of thought it might have been an accident. I wasn't really sure how the development of collection went, anything like that. So I was new to all that. So I sat down and asked those questions. I was like, hey, did someone in the community request these books? And she was like, no one's requested these books. And I was like, okay, well, how do you come to get books in the library? And she explained to me that there is a company that they use, I think called the Ingram Group, and it's like a vendor where it's like a third party, where they order from publishers and send them to the libraries. And so, because the libraries do librarians have a big job and do a lot of work, they receive these emails from their vendor, and they go through this list of books that this organization thinks might be popular in the library. And
So how do they determine how books might be popular?
I think they use reviews from different review companies and ALA and
The American Library Association. Okay. And so books that have won awards, maybe.
right.
Okay. And then so just to make sure I understand, so they get the books from a publishing group. So they're buying them from the publisher.
I don't think the Ingram Group's a
Or,
publisher.
but they get them from the publishers, they collect them, and then, because I guess what it sounds like to me, and maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong, it's the publishers are telling the groups what to buy, and then the groups recommend it to the library, is that?
I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I think the publishers do have their recommendations in the sense of what they think is really being given awards, or what's, working in the places that maybe kind of got started in the different spaces for like selling, like Books A Million and Amazon and things. But actually, I kind of noticed that libraries seem to get books before even those places. I was kind of seeing the dates of the time certain things came to the library, or before, and it was actually sometimes prior to the publication date. So maybe there is something else going on that I'm not quite equipped to answer today. But I would do say that was what was told to me, that according to them, it would be what would be popular, what would be popular. And then I was like, well, I'm looking at the library policies, and it says that y'all order books based on community demand, like what your community wants. And that's when I said, have these books been checked out? And the original 6 to 10, I can't remember, books I brought to her, they had not been checked out from the library, except for mine friend on accident ones. But so they hadn't been checked out, and they had been in the library for a while. I just hadn't noticed them. And so I think between when they were ordered back in 2022 to May, those books had not been checked out. Now, once I brought it to the public attention, a lot.
Well, and some people have said that bringing these books to light and challenging them and telling everybody about them actually makes people go get them. It tells kids that they're there, and then they go looking for them. What do you say to that?
That might be a possibility.
But yeah.
I don't think that anyone's gonna be like, oh my gosh, there's books that are gonna question my kid's sexuality. Where can I get those? I don't think that's legitimate. I think if we're raising awareness, it's specifically for the fact that, the safety, well-being of our children, that's it, right? And I don't think anyone's like, hears that, it's like, oh man, this is a great place to go get some child porn. I don't
So,
know.
and you say the safety and well-being, that brings me to a point that people have said that, some of the kids that are most high risk for, suicide, for, depression and anxiety are children who are dealing with gender dysphoria, and I'm probably not, I don't even know if that's what they're calling it right now, but kids who are unhappy with the gender that they are, expressing some, problems, presenting with,
Sure.
coping with that, and that if we don't allow kids to have access to these materials through a local library, then it's telling them that they're, we don't care about them, that they're alone and they're isolated, and that it compounds that problem. Like, what's the answer to that, do you believe?
I don't think statistically that's set up. I can't sit here and quote research this or research that. Everything that I've seen, that I've looked at is basically, the suicide rates of people who have gone into transition. I've met with detransitioners, people who've gone through that process and then come back from it. And some of the people who have physically transitioned to a certain point where they can't come back from that, and now they're having mental health issues because they can't come back from it, and believe that they were sold a lie, and then some hospital that did the physical transitions made a ton of money off of selling them that lie. And so I think there's mental health issues on both sides of it. My heart breaks for people that are in that situation where they're beginning to question their sexuality or their gender. Again, there's all these different terminologies it's hard to keep up with. That's unfortunate, but going and transitioning and then having surgeries that mutilate you and change you into how God created you, that's not going to then lead you into the pastures of joy and peace and happiness. I don't think.
Can I?
Yes, sir.
So I was, so you know how much of a research person I am, and I love statistics, I love study, I love research. I've actually looked at some statistics. I got some statistics, some studies that were done from the National Institutes of Health. The study was actually titled Mental Health Diagnoses Among Transgender Patients in the Clinical Setting. And they had studied and questioned 10,270 transgender patients. And of those, they've identified that 58% had at least one psychiatric diagnosis compared to 13.6% in the control patient population group. And that the transgender patients had a statistically significant increase in prevalence for all psychiatric diagnoses queried, with major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder being the most common. And then it goes on, and then there was another study done by Dr. John Pachenkis, who was from Yale, the School of Public Health. And he talks about the fact that those that believe they have transgender, I guess is congruency, are 6 times more likely to have a mood anxiety disorder than general population, 3 times as likely to be prescribed antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications, and 6 times more likely to attempt suicide, resulting in hospitalization. And so, according to some studies and some research data, I can see that, but what I fear the problem is the identity crisis in today's culture and community. Transgender is the identity crisis. Decades ago, it wasn't just transgender, it was who am I? We're always searching for these worldview questions. Whenever you're looking at a worldview, you answer, how did I get here, where am I going, and what is the meaning of life? And one of those is, why am I here? What is my purpose of existence? And ever since the creation of the garden, mankind has always struggled with our identity. Who am I as an individual, as a person with a soul? And the farther away we get from God, the more we try to go ahead and put a Band-Aid on all of our issues and all of our problems and all of our stresses and all of our struggles. And so while today it's the discussion of transgenderism, 50 years ago it was sexual promiscuity, and you got Marilyn Monroe back then and people of that ilk. We're always going to battle the identity crisis. I just think in today's terminology, transgenderism, gender dysphoria, transgender congruency, things of that nature, is just a label that we struggle with. Who am I? And apart from Jesus Christ, we're never going to find the true peace and the true identity on who we really are.
So you mentioned Jesus Christ. You mentioned Jesus Christ, and the library, you know, is a publicly funded institution, and you know, people say, well, because they are there for the entire public, it shouldn't be one religion, one group of people that's deciding what books are going to go in the library. And so, but what I'm hearing is I haven't heard anybody say that transitioning or homosexuality are a problem based on a religious viewpoint. From this standpoint, you were citing statistics of people who are experiencing, you know, problems as they're going through transitioning, etc. And that, so I guess what I'm trying to say is, I haven't heard a religious opposition to the trans ideology coming up in children's literature. It's been more statistic evidence that this is not a healthy thing to be teaching children. But that being said, I would say all of us up here are Christians, and we do believe that it is against the word of God to change your gender, because God made you fearfully and wonderfully made, and you were created, and like creation said it's good, you know. So, but what would you say? People say that, well, one religion shouldn't be driving the book selection of the library. So, like, how do we approach that and make sure that we're allowing multiple viewpoints and perspectives to be represented in the collections? Like, how do we draw that line?
So I think it's this idea of the myth of neutrality, right? Is that something can be neutral. It can't be. There's going to be one religion and one culture that is ruling over others. For 200 years, that's what it was in America, was Christians. We were Christians, and even if you weren't a professing believer, you obeyed laws that came from our entire legal system that was based in Israel's civil code and English common law that was interpreted by William Blackstone. We were a Christian nation, and we flourished as a Christian nation. And then this idea, this myth of neutrality, as multiculturalism and everything else started happening in our nation, we tried to do this seat at the table thing. And then what ended up happening is that Christians got pushed into this corner, and we're not allowed to have a seat at the table, and everyone else does. And so it's not whether there is a God who is ruling through laws in a land or libraries in a land, it's which God, okay? And there's a God of secular humanism, Marxism, communism, all these other things. You can see it because it's the exact opposite. Anything that God says is good, this worldview says is bad. Anything that God says is bad, this worldview says is good. And so it's God's creation that he says is good has been flipped up on its head, and Christians are basically being forced to just eat it, just take it, right? And so there is a worldview that is reigning supreme right now in these institutions, and Christians are the ones that are being forced to say, well, that's too bad. And if we say, but, well, you know, separation of church and state, right? And that's not even, I mean, I could go on for hours, which I'm going to try not to do, I promise, about the separation of church and state, and I'll just go through a real quick piece of that. So the idea of the whole separation of church and state is because church is an institution created by God, the family is an institution created by God, and then there's the civil sphere, which is state, if you will. All three of these spheres operate under the lordship of Christ. This was how our government was founded. And so Christ is Lord over your family, Christ is Lord over the church, and Christ is Lord over the state, okay? So yes, the church was separate from the state because the church's job is to preach the word, protect the word, to administer the sacraments and do these things, also to practice church discipline. The civil magistrate's job is to punish bad behavior and reward good, essentially. And so you can't have the church executing people that break laws, right? And you can't have the state kicking people out of church because they
So
sin.
that's the separation.
That's the separation of church and state. It's not that God isn't in the state. God has always been in the state in America until about 50 years ago. He's always been there. We've always acknowledged him. Every single one of these library, and this gets me so worked up. Every single one of these library board people who are too much of cowards to get this crap out of our libraries, I bet they put their hand on a Bible when they got sworn in. Every single civil magistrate in the United States of America places their hand on the Bible, and they pledge, and they say that they're going to uphold the United States Constitution. If it's a local leader, it'll be the state constitution. And with their hand on the Bible, they're saying in a way that brings honor to God. That's what we're here to do, and you're putting your hand on a Bible. That didn't just happen because we were a multicultural, religiously plural place. It's because God was over your families, God was over the churches, and God was over the state, and we've always acknowledged that.
You know, that's amazing. I want to add to that as well, because you brought up the aspect of the lordship of Christ over all three realms. And rightfully so, and as a Christian apologist, it's one of the questions that I regularly get is, how do you know Christianity is the one true religion? Isn't that just being intolerant of other views? Well, we got to look at what is the objective truth. If there is an objective truth, if there is a moral standard, then we have to find out where is this moral standard coming from. And if we realize that, like what is commonly used within Christian apologetics realm, that it is immoral to torture innocent babies for fun, if that is a universal immoral practice, we have to ask ourselves, how is that universal? How is that transcendent? Why is that fact that it doesn't matter what time, what culture, what area you live, what religion you practice, it is just wrong to torture innocent babies for fun. If we find but one universal transcendent truth out there, we have to figure out why. Why is it there? I imagine every single person in this audience has once asked the question, why am I here? Or, what is the meaning of life? What's amazing is the fact that every single human being alive, I would argue, asked themselves that question at one point in time of their life. And the fact that question is intrinsic into the heart of human beings, in that it is transcendent across time, culture, everywhere, that reveals that there has to be somebody up there that put that thought in our hearts. And so the question naturally is, who is this person? Who is this being that loves us enough to try to get us to reach out to him? And that's where when we can spend all of our time trying to look at all the religions in the world, but it's like the FBI trying to study counterfeit bills. They don't spend their time studying every counterfeit that's out there. They have to look at what is the real authentic bill. And then the more they know that, the more they can spot fakes. For me, it all goes back to the empty tomb. If that tomb is empty 2,000 years ago, that changes everything. And if that tomb is truly empty and Jesus physically rose from the dead, then that changes everything. And if that's the case, then as C.S. Lewis said, we have to answer the question, Jesus is a liar, lunatic, or Lord? And if we come to the realization Jesus Christ is Lord, then we got to find out what the creator of the cosmos wants us to do with his creation and us as living people and ambassadors here on this earth. And so I love when you brought up the lordship of Christ. For me, with the library issue, I think it goes all the way back to worldviews. Like I said, now we're going to be discussing this particular topic. 100 years from now, it's going to be something else. It's going to be artificial intelligence and ethical rules and dilemmas with that. And so the problem's always going to be there, but the solution is defined in Christ.
So, like what you're saying with if we're thinking back, for example, when libraries were started, and that worldview of Christ being Lord over all, like, I think it was like Harvard, that used to be part of their motto was Christ and truth, and they've removed the Christ part now, but that was the worldview and that was the purpose when they were started. It was understood that we answer to a higher authority. And you had different denominations back then. You had different, Protestant, Catholic. It wasn't that they were all united under one denomination, but that there was a supreme authority and things were done in accordance with the standards of that supreme authority. You mentioned about 50 years ago that things started changing, and we're seeing those influences now in our institutions. Like, can you speak more to that? Where are those influences coming from? Or
I have something, but I'll save it. I'll save it.
I gave it to her.
Oh,
She had it. I got it back though.
because I guess what I'm asking is, how do do we get from a society that we founded libraries? We are, and I'm not saying it was an idyllic, perfect society. We've always been riddled with sin. We've always had sin as a problem. Even in our Constitution, we started out with slavery. We started out with, women having not the same place that they occupy now in society. So I'm not saying that it was an idyllic, since we've, Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, it's been a mess. So, but we had a constitutional basis to work from. We had the authority of God over that, from which we get our rights, from the way I understand it. Although I did go to public school, so I did not learn that in public school, but I've been told since then. So I guess what I'm asking is, how do you go from a place like in Alabama? People generally believe in God. They generally believe in being good. They generally believe in decency. So how do you go from that to having where people are like, no, we definitely need books that most people would call are inappropriate for kids in our library. We need them.
Putting it nicely.
And where did that influence come from? You mentioned about 50 years ago. I think that probably kind of lines up a little bit with what we're seeing.
Yeah.
If I'm correct.
So it's twofold. So on the Christian part, and I may get stoned for this, but I'm okay with that. I couldn't anyway. I haven't gotten killed at 18, 19 now. I don't know. I believe so. I'll start with the Christians, and then I'll go to the communists. Okay. And so Christians' problem, I believe, is an eschatological problem. Okay.
What does eschatology
eschatological is a study of the end times. Okay. And in 1850, Schofield put out a Bible, and really this idea of what's called dispensational rapture, tribulation, eschatology, started in the 1850s.
But when you say rapture and tribulation, tell me what that means.
I mean, so I'm pretty sure even people who aren't Christians believe this. You know what I mean? When they refer to Christians, they automatically think that we're thinking of the rapture and so on and so forth.
Like the Left Behind movies.
Correct, right? And so, but the point is Christians have fallen into this place where we're waiting for Jesus to come get us. But you mentioned, what did it say at Harvard, right? It had Christ on it. So who made Harvard? Christians. Who made Princeton? Who made Yale? Christians. Who built the hospitals? Christians. Okay, who came over this massive sea, and what did they do it for in the Mayflower Compact? For Christ and his glory, that his kingdom would be recognized on this new continent. Christians have always been builders, and they go and they do and they go and they build for the glory of God. And historically, from before 1850 back to when Christ rose from the dead, the eschatology was one of going out and building his kingdom. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We're ushering in Christ's kingdom through faithful obedience to his word here on this earth. And we don't do that when we're waiting for him to come get us next Tuesday. Oh, it wasn't next Tuesday? Okay, it's the next Tuesday. If you carry the 6 and the hypotenuse to the right triangle, I think I got it right here next month, he's coming. Right? And that's not it. We've been put here to usher in his kingdom, and Christians always understood that, specifically the ones that came over here to America to begin to build. And so we build these incredible institutions for the glory of God, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, so that they would have an education, an incredible education, so that they could go on and do science for the glory of God. They would know history, the history of God's people and Western civilization. Another point, what was Western civilization called until 50 years ago? It was called Christendom. That was just what it was referred to. It was known as Christendom, because it was when the gospel goes forth out through the West, it flourished and created everything that we now call Western civilization. It was Christendom. So I believe what has happened is this bad eschatology has gotten into the church, and it's forced us all to have a defeatist mindset that we're going to lose down here. We're going to lose down here, so we might as well start canning green beans and praying that Jesus comes back next week, rather than going and building news outlets, rather than going and building classical Christian academies, and going and building and doing these things, which is what we're called to do. We haven't done that because we think that we're going to lose down here. And I think, anyway, you guys, you have tomatoes and rocks.
But surely you're not blaming all of this on pre-trib people, right?
It's any trib.
Okay.
Is
So pre-trib, that means you rapture before judgment rings
Yeah.
down and the seals are open.
So, and just to tie a bow on it before I go into the communists, anytime you're talking about the tribulation, this eschatology that I speak of, which is historic optimistic eschatology, some people call it postmillennial, some people call it partial preterist, blah, 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 blah. Okay? It is the tribulation that Jesus is talking about happened in AD 70 when Rome came in and destroyed the temple. He said, not one stone will be standing on another. Well, that happened in AD 70. The temple was destroyed. And so the fulfillment of the tribulation passages and all of that discourse by Jesus were fulfilled in AD 70. And so I'm not going to turn this into an evening of eschatology with Brian Dawson. I'm going to stop there. But say it's something you guys should explore is the possibility that this very new system of belief started 200 years ago, not even 200 years ago.
Well, you mentioned Schofield, and this is like the middle 1800s. I'm
Yeah.
thinking the German philosophers are gaining notoriety, and people are reading their work. There's Darwin going around saying, actually, guys weren't created, you know. And not only that, different colors of people from different areas, we're not the same race. Some of us are a little more evolved than others. So you have those, it sounds like this is a time period where we have a lot of philosophies coming in. How does that work then into our American institutions we've seen, for example, with Marxism. And I mean, this sounds crazy. I'm a kid I grew up in the Reagan era. I hear people talk about Marxists and I'm like, guys, come on. I feel like Obama. They call your 1980s foreign policy call, you know. There's a part of my brain that's been training, things like that. However, what is Marxism? You look at the definition, it's anti-God, anti-family, it's it's that when everybody owns everything, nobody owns anything, is what happens there. So how does this, we have the president of the American Library Association, for example, is an avowed Marxist.
And lesbian.
And she, yes, she's Emily Drabinski. Now, they choose a president. Their president is sort of their symbolic figurehead for not a long period of time, but this was the person that they specifically chose in this statement. And how can we see, I guess here's my question, if Marxism was working its way in, for example, to the American Library Association, how do we see that, and Hannah, maybe you can speak to this a little bit with your research on the ALA and how their influence affects our libraries. How does that come in to where it's affecting our local library?
Right.
Yeah.
That was the second
All right.
thing. So you had Christians' problem, how Christians let this in, and now you have the communists. So Christians failed. That's where I put the blame first. I don't put the blame outside. Okay. The first thing I need to do as a father is look at myself. How am I loving my wife? How am I training my children? Look at my church, and so on and so forth. So in this whole mess that we find ourselves in culturally, the first place I'm going to look to is the church and Christians and say, what did we do wrong? Meanwhile, okay, so in the 1930s, and really First World War, and we'll go back to Karl Marx and when he was born in the 1800s. And so there's a catechism that said, who wrote the Bible? So I asked my children, who wrote the Bible? They say, holy men that were taught by the Holy Spirit. And so we understand that the Holy Bible was written by the inspiration of God through people, and people put pen to paper, but they were inspired by the Spirit of God, and they wrote it, and it was canonized, and that's how we get Scripture. Well, listen to this story. Karl Marx, no one had any idea who this guy was, right? He was just this German guy, and he lived in squalor. His wife was a mess, his kids were a mess, and he would sleep for 2 or 3 days at a time on his couch, and he would wake up at 3 in the morning and just fervently write for hours, and then he would go back to sleep, and he'd sleep for days. And he'd get up and he would write at 2 or 3 in the morning, and he would write and write and write and write. And he died, and 3 people were at his funeral. No one had any clue who this guy was, okay? Well, his writings were picked up by Vladimir Lenin, and those went on to inspire everything that we know in that period. But this whole idea of Bolshevism, Marxism, communism, all of these things, it's a destabilization of the West, or a destabilization of Christendom. This is the undergirdings of the entire thing. Take down the patriarchy. Take everything that God said and has created, they want to uproot it. Every single thing that God says is good, they say is bad. Everything he says is bad, they say is good. And so this happens. They were able to do it forcefully through a populist uprising, through basically wealth class. Like, the poor aren't getting enough, so the poor rose up and overthrew the czars in Russia. Well, they tried to move west and do that in the 1930s, and it didn't work. They were stopped. What they didn't understand is that in the Christian West, people were not as interested in money, they were interested in God and country. And so they went back and said, okay, how are we going to move Marxism west? We can't do it by tank and through, wealth warfare. There's a word, class warfare. That's not gonna work. And so they sent their greatest thinkers to Frankfurt, Germany in the 1930s in the Frankfurt School, okay? And they go into the Frankfurt School in the 1930s, and then there was this guy with a weird mustache that didn't feel good about Jewish people, and these were all Jewish people, so they left the Frankfurt School. They weren't safe there, and they went to Columbia University. And that was when it began. And so Herbert Marcuse and Alexander Gramsci, their writing said it is the long march through the institutions. It's patient plotting and infecting these Christian institutions and bringing them into submission to Marxist ideology. And they have slowly plotted their way through, and they took over Columbia universities and all the Ivy League colleges. And then it went down to normal colleges, and then it went down from normal colleges into
But
normal
I
education.
gotta ask, because I went to a state school.
Yeah.
How could I have been in communist there, not, like, surrounded by communism and not known it?
So it's not communism. So communism is the economic philosophy that becomes a manifestation of its way that they use force to do things. What you were in was not a school that was submitted to Christ, right? And right, that's what it was. And it was telling you, right? And it's telling you things that don't line up with what your parents probably believed, or if you had Christian parents, right? So it's whatever it is, it's anti-God. And so that it happens in the education system. Any cultural shaping institution was completely taken over by Marxists. And so you have the public education system, higher education, all the way on down to kindergarten now, public libraries. And then you have Hollywood, you have every media, news, all of these things have been completely hijacked. And the Democrat Party now. The Democrat Party, everybody in this room 30 years ago would have been, we'll say 50 years ago, would have been a Democrat. If you worked for a paycheck, you were a Democrat in the South. That's just the way it was. Now the Democrat Party has been completely hijacked by Marxists, okay? And so that they've taken over political parties, culture-shaping institutions, and then all the way down to being on every single library board in every single small town. I mean,
So, yeah, and with that, like, Hannah, I think that segues really well into, like, you know, if our library was being influenced by Marxists, wouldn't we know it? And so, like, that sounds, people think that sounds absolutely nuts. I can hear them in my head because these are the people who educated me. I hear them in my head going, that's nuts, you know, of course there's not Marxists doing this. So how would we notice that this is, I don't mean this like this is a red scare, we must go find Marxists and root them out, or, you know, in every neighborhood or whatever, but how is that ideology seen then in what we're putting in the library for our kids?
Yeah, whew, okay, there's been a lot of good discussion. I was like, I had 80,000 thoughts. I'm gonna try to consolidate them at different chat. But I agree that it was intended to be like that slow crawl, maybe that was what you said. So how were we supposed to notice? Well, I think some of it was unintentional. I mean, intentionally that we weren't supposed to notice. It was supposed to be slow, a slow trickle to where it was just like, okay, I'll compromise that. Okay, I'll compromise this. And then you get to a scary place, and then everybody goes, how did we get here? And you're like, well, it's really been here. You just weren't paying enough attention. And so we're to blame here. I feel like saying is, Brian, that Christians are a little bit to blame, and I might tend to blame certain eschatologies too, but we won't be one-sided here. But I would say, even to that, you can't, people with that eschatological view, John MacArthur and Ali Stephanie, share those, but they more so align with our philosophy on how we're supposed to infiltrate the government. So I think you can be a pre-trib and still want to put forth Christianity. So yeah, yes. But circling back to the libraries with the ALA, so I think, I'm sure that the American Library Association was established for good reason. It was in the early 1900s. I can't remember the exact date right now, because, lots of talking. But for some reason I want to say 1930, but Andrew might be answer quicker than me.
39.
And do what?
39.
39, well, it's close. Okay, 1939. And so I'm sure it was pure motive at that point. But at some point in time, what we started noticing, I would say probably in the 70s, but for sure by year 2000, we have the Child Protection Act. Is that, I think, it's blanking on me a little bit, but the Child Internet Protection Act, thank you, where you had the ALA actively fighting against the government, against simply putting porn filters on computers in public libraries, right? If anybody's ever been to the...
Why would they do that? Why would they fight that?
Why would they fight porn filters? Oh, That's a good question, right? Like, so kind of comes back to like a general morality issue of, just one second for questions, but.
What the ALA did was, at the time the internet was formed, was that they were looking at searches on the internet, and they found that, as an example, that you cite if you search for the word breast, that you couldn't, it wouldn't show up when with the filters at that time. So they recommended that libraries not filter because of that. That's how the recommendation started. Now, I've been sitting here being very quiet because I was in charge of the Mobile Public Library for 23 years. I'm just here as an observer though, but I'll answer that question. Okay, so that's how that got started. Now, many libraries today still provide the internet as the Mobile Public does. And there's a filter on at that point. And it's to filter out pornography, or what the real word is obscene. And that was the reason that it's still there. And when I was in charge of the public library at that time, I knew what the ALA had suggested, and to not use filters, but I was aware of the female staff the people that would walk in and want to look at that were not the greatest residents that we had, or how would I put it?
Well, right, so this kind of comes back down to,
we installed filters. That's all I'm telling you.
yes, you should have, and that's right.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that background. Unfortunately tonight with the set that we have, we're not gonna be able to do a back and forth with the audience. But you could email our email.
Well, I don't have anything else to say. It was just
Well, but I appreciate that background too.
clarification for that one thing.
Well, that's
But
what,
I think what my follow-up question on that was, why would there have been an objection to have to force libraries to do that? Because it really took, the government to get involved and say, no, you really need to do this. Because there's a philosophy guiding the Bill of Rights, am I correct, of the ALA, that they, on their website, they do say that it is their position to not restrict any information from any person for any reason, like that's their ideal that they would follow. So I guess that would have been my follow-up on that.
right, so, back in 2000, you have the internet, coming about, well, had been around, but, realizing, oh no, there's things on the internet that children and maybe general society should not be looking at in public. And so, whereas I think it comes back down to general, morality, and society as a whole holds certain truths to be real, like murder is bad, but don't steal, don't lie. Most people agree to that. And so I think for a long time, we all agreed that children should not be exposed to sexual content. I thought that was still true when I entered this issue. I thought, as a community, especially in small town Alabama, I thought, surely we all still believe in protecting children. We might not agree on lots of things, but protecting children, top on the list, I was sure. I was dead wrong, but I was sure. And so I thought that was something. And so I think that was the issue with the computers coming into the libraries all of a sudden, which were great. It was a great thing that the computers came into the library, because someone that didn't have a computer at home could come in and fill out a resume, understand the purpose of it, and use the internet in various ways, which is good for the community. But obviously, just because it's for the community and it's for everybody doesn't mean Brian has a right to come in and watch porn in front of everybody else in the middle of the library. So I think it comes back down to these obvious, well, like we all would say, it's pretty obvious that you shouldn't watch porn in public, right? There's a reason why it's done in quiet and in the dark, not out in public. But apparently some people were actually still willing to go in public and watch it in front of librarians and infringing on those librarians' rights. And so I think a lot of people were in uproar about that. But the ALA, being, you would think advocating for libraries, was opposed to this. And so they were saying, no, we can't restrict any access. Brian has complete right, or I'm sorry, I'm picking on you. to go in there and watch porn. You can't restrict that because he needs access to everything and you should
So,
just put up.
but I mean, I think that sounds kind of extreme, and people would say, well, now kids just use their phones. My thing is, I'm not buying your kid's phone. I didn't pay for it, and I'm
Our kids won't get anyone.
and I'm not, yeah, so, I mean, regardless, like, I'm not buying other people's kids' phones, I'm not paying for them, I'm not gonna answer to God for what their kid was looking at. I will answer to God for what my tax dollars fund and what I did about it. So that's kind of where I stand at this personally, and so I think that the pornography on computers could be, like, well, that's kind of extreme. I mean, of course, that they were gonna put filters on them. So what's the issue though with, is there actually, when it comes to the books, is there actually pornographic material in the kids section? Or is it just books about two dads? Or is it just books about, like, you know, the first trans lady that became a senator, or whatever, yeah. I mean, is it really sexual content for kids? And I think that's, because that's an objection that I've heard sometimes is, you know, it's not really that extreme, is it?
Well, I'll let you answer too, but I think it's important that we define our terms here. When we all talk about children, we think of minors, 18 and under, when we're using the word children, it's not just us saying that, it's the Alabama State Code, that, defines that term. And so tell me if we need a break, but, and so.
Yeah.
Okay, we need a break in a second, but let me just finish my thought, so it won't come back to it, so, and it might have already left, so, what was I saying? Okay.
Is there really porn in
Is there really porn? Yes, so children, yes, if you're under the age of 18, so like the young adult section, which we'll get into that on the second time around, is riddled with pornography, tons of sexual content, and for the 12 and under, you find more of the gender affirming care stuff, the abnormal sexualities, expression of bisexual, asexual, all the terms.
So like, how many books are we talking about in our own library? Like, how many books?
I think we've contested
Like
48
five?
at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
48, and that's in the kid section or the young adult section?
goodness.
Just for people who may not be up to speed on the status of things that, so, there's been 48 that have been challenged, and what has been the response of the library when people are bringing books to their attention? Like, can you give a few examples? And, like, what do they do with them when that happens?
The one you probably want.
But I mean, the ones that have been reviewed, like, can you maybe speak to that a little bit? Like, when someone has brought forward a book, they filled out a form, how has the library responded? And then, like on some, maybe give some examples of that.
Right, so you have this, process of reconsideration.
Just for like five more minutes.
5 more minutes, okay. We have this process of, reconsideration of materials that's in the library policies. It's something that every library, to my understanding, does. I mean, everyone in the state of Alabama that I've spoken to uses the same. So it comes from the ALA. And so you have these reconsideration of materials. So parents can come in, the new parents would come in and object to certain things, and people joke about books being and all that. But anyway, so they have this process set up. But the intention of the process, if you go on the ALA website and spend not even 5 whole minutes, you'll learn that it's not intended for you. The reconsideration materials is not meant for parents. They're telling you that. But it's meant to, it says guard against censorship. So the whole process is set up against you, not for you. And so they can say whatever they want in a library board meeting. But if you go on the website, you see very differently, very quickly. It's to guard against. So the goal is to always keep the book where it is. It's never meant to move it. And actually, so far in the history of Prattville's library, to my understanding, at least to the current board, which has been on there for 20-something years, a lot of them, and that there had never been a reconsideration of materials brought forward. Many people had come to the director and had a conversation, but once they got to that point, no one followed through.
So even in the 50s, like, no one had filled out forms for any books about, like.
Not in this library director's knowledge of the library, but it could have been.
Because I mean, the library's been since what, 1950s?
60s,
I've heard people talk about, like, during the time of segregation, that people were filling out book forms about, maybe books that they didn't like what they said about race or whatever, that, So I wasn't sure of that. Okay, so.
I can't go
They
say
could not
for
see
sure
that.
to that far back, but to far back to her knowledge, I'm
Okay.
the first person to ever fill out the consideration.
We're gonna break right there and pick it up, and, so here in about, let's go about 13 minutes. Nice even number. And, well, the restrooms are out there if you go out to your door, the main doors here, they'll be down the hall to your left by the drinking fountains. And then we do have water and refreshments at the table back there if you like something to drink or something to snack on. So, just make yourself comfortable.